Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for everyone who's joined us. Welcome. I think that it's going to be an interesting presentation, hopefully, but I'm more looking forward to the discussion because we have two extremely brilliant and knowledgeable discussants. So I'm not going to spend all the time on the presentation. I'm going to, sorry, I just need to find the run slideshow from the beginning. Yeah, okay. So can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Nadia.
Okay. So I'm going to switch off my camera so that there's no issues with that. And well, doesn't seem like it's letting me do that. Anyway, so this presentation is based on a policy brief that we've published with the Human Sciences Research Council team of myself, Dr. Ben Roberts, Dr. Derek Davids, Dr. Stephen Gordon, and Yamkela Majikajela. It's based on work that we've been doing for quite a while. So this presentation goes a little bit further than the policy brief does because we've been constantly dealing with the various aspects of this work, and we've been digging a little bit deeper, especially when it comes to vaccines. So I just decided to start with a quote because this isn't an easy topic to speak about, especially if you have been a human rights activist your whole life, and sometimes the outcome of research doesn't speak to you in the way that it should. So autocracy is certainly more predictable than democracy. Autocracy has none of the last-minute high-wire thrill of democratic politics, but the unpredictable nature of democracy is not least due to the fact that the citizen is the ultimate source of power. And that is why, after all, democracy is a glorious mess. So there's a glorious messiness that we are dealing with now and that we have been dealing with during COVID. And we need to keep in mind that this is not a simple issue, that it is in fact a glorious mess. So, rights, a cornerstone of democracy in South Africa. The values that we live by, human dignity, equality, and freedom. And the issue that we've explored in this research is around freedom. The state must respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the rights in the Bill of Rights. And of course, the rights are subject to limitations contained too in Section 36 and elsewhere in the bill. So there are internal limitations to human rights in the Bill of Rights, such as the right to freedom of speech, as we all know. And there is also a number of other ways in which we can or may limit rights. And this is really what's been happening over the past year. I think it's almost a year now. So let me look at some of the views. So in the survey that we did, we had open-ended questions where we asked people to send messages to the president on any matter that they wanted to regarding this particular issue. So the first one is really around how people understand rights and how this particular person understood the rights. So she states that any restrictions on our rights need to be logical and transparent. If we don't see the point of them or they seem arbitrary, as is now the case, then it is difficult to distinguish which make sense, such as masks, from those which are nonsense, such as what clothes we can buy or buying cigarettes. So cigarettes is a big issue. Yes?
Let me disturb you. Pardon me, Prof. We can see your notes and there's a little box on your presentation there. We can't see. Yeah, you can click where it says turn on.
Okay. Is that?
Okay, close it. Okay, got it.
got it.
And then there's 3 dots there. Below your presentation, there's 3 dots. Click there. Yes. Click there. And then hide presenter view.
Okay.
Let's see.
That better?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay. So cigarettes were a big issue, and people really felt that they had the right to smoke. So we were very intrigued by the way in which people understood their rights, and we wanted to delve further. But with this presentation, I'm really only going to look at the quantitative issues, because we haven't mined the qualitative data sufficiently yet, but I'm just giving some examples. So as already mentioned, rights may be limited in terms of Section 36. What's important here is that the limitation must be deemed reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society. Government action must be rational, and there are tests for that, and of course proportional to its aim when limiting rights. So these are technical legal issues, but I'm just going to leave it at that for now. So when we're looking at weighing rights, balancing rights, and the issue of public opinion, there are just a few initial things that I wanted to say about that. So regulations So weighing up competing interests and values may determine attitudes and perceptions. For instance, the value placed on life and the common good versus the value placed on comfort and the retention of privilege. The protection of self and others may well be values that outweigh freedom during an epidemic. That is a wide statement, and it's very debatable. The public's views are not the only consideration to be considered, as the court held when abolishing the death penalty in the case of State versus Makwanyane. In fact, there were some dangers that were pointed out, but it is one of the factors that should be taken into account in a participatory democracy and weighed against other factors. And we thought that this public opinion research, because we're in a very unusual situation during the pandemic, would assist in getting some of these public views to the fore. So there was an online survey that was conducted using a data-free app, as well as social media adverts on Facebook and Twitter. The Moya Messenger app, which is operated by Banyu, has 4 million users, 800,000 of whom use the app every day. And the demographic is very representative of that of the country. The survey was available in 6 languages: English, isiZulu, isiXhosa, Setswana, Sesotho, and Afrikaans. There you can see round 1 was from 13 April to 11 May, which was at the beginning, right at the beginning. And the response rate was 12,312. Round 2 was from the 3rd of July to the 11th of September, and the response rate was slightly lower at 9,519, because I think COVID fatigue was creeping in a little bit there. And round 3 took place in a very short period of time, and we had a very large amount of completed responses, 10,618. So our sample size was very good throughout the survey. So we always have to explain the methodology when we do our research. We have to be sure that the research and the data that we put out there is tested and robustly tested. So the data was benchmarked or weighted to the distribution of South Africa's adult population. The results were weighted by age, race, and education. And according to Stats SA 2016 Community Survey population estimates. So this allows the data to be broadly generalizable to the country. And we were very honored to have a former statistician general on our team. So he kept us on our toes. So what did it feel like for many of us? I felt like I was locked up in a jail in my own home, and that's very bad since I have rights. So people did comment a lot on human rights and their rights, but the understanding was sometimes different. And so we see that the interesting outcome, are you willing to sacrifice some human rights to stop the spread of COVID-19? So that's the specific aspect of the question, the aspects of the question that are important. Are you willing to sacrifice specific human rights, some human rights, to stop the spread of COVID? So it wasn't a general question. So the percentages there you can see are very high in all three rounds. 78% of South Africans were willing to sacrifice their human rights to stop the spread of the virus in the first round. It dipped down to 72 in the second round and then went back up to 78 in the third round. So there wasn't much difference across the rounds as to this general question that was, are you willing to sacrifice your rights? But when we broke it down to which rights you're willing to sacrifice, then the outcome was slightly different. So by demographic attributes, we can see there that the national average, the sort of lights, the light orange one, 76%, and well, it should be 78%. Anyway, the demographic group most willing to sacrifice their rights were Black South Africans at 81%. The demographic in South Africa that were least willing to sacrifice their rights were white South Africans at 58%. And then you can see the difference in age. So sort of the younger and middle ages, but the not very young, are relatively willing to sacrifice, as well as 55 plus. But then it goes down, and interestingly, post-matric is also are a group that are not specifically interested in sacrificing their rights. So political identification is also quite interesting. ANC and EFF supporters were more willing than DA supporters to sacrifice human rights. And this tendency increased. What's interesting here is this was over 2 rounds. We didn't ask this question in the first survey. But you can see there 81% and 86% of ANC supporters in rounds 2 and 3. EFF supporters also very high at 78 and 82%. What's interesting there is from round 2, DA supporters were prepared to sacrifice only 54%, and this went up to 69% at the end of December, beginning of January, and the same with supporters of other parties, which went up to 72%. So combating COVID-19 does not require the suspension of all rights and freedoms. That's obvious, and we wouldn't want that. Obvious questions then is, which specific rights would South Africans be prepared to temporarily forego as a result of the situation that we are in? So in rounds 2 and 3, we actually asked specific questions. Are you willing to sacrifice the following rights? And you can see those rights in red on the slide. So we put it in simple language, but these are all related to rights and freedoms in the Bill of Rights. So would you sacrifice, based on lockdown, your right to your place of worship, your right to travel from place to place, your right to attend school and university, your right to be private and not share information with government, your right to work, your right to protest, or you are not willing to sacrifice any of these rights? So there was an interesting outcome here, and that is that there was a difference when we asked people about specific rights. So they could list all of the rights, or they could list some of the rights. But it seemed as if the rights, well, it was the finding was that the right to go to your place of worship was the right that people were most willing to sacrifice. The second was the right to travel from place to place. Interestingly, the right to attend school and university was 1/3, 1/4 to 1/3 of the respondents. The right to protest, a little bit less so. Clearly, sacrificing the right to work was low, but it was still about 25, an average of 25% across the round. The right that people really aren't willing to sacrifice based on the survey results was the right to be private and not share information with government. So we did some logical regression analysis, and the common predictors for these answers to the specific rights were confidence in the president's handling of the pandemic, income, and education. Social solidarity had a weak effect compared to the strong effect on general willingness to sacrifice. So general willingness to sacrifice, the idea of it, the ideology, showed us that there was a level of social solidarity that existed. However, people who were more willing to sacrifice when looking at the specific rights were the ones that were confident in the president, who had a lower income and a lower level of education. Those who feel situation remained the same or uncertain, less likely to sacrifice religious assembly and education. No significant difference between those who feel the situation will improve and those who feel it will worsen. And gender, age, and race have varied effects. So in late 2020, there was mounting disquiet about the signs of failure to adhere to COVID-19 preventative behaviors. So COVID fatigue was creeping in. And then as the vaccination programs rolled out, well, it's not really rolling out, but as we started to talk about vaccines and wait for vaccines, we had to also remain compliant to basic health promotion measures to minimize the risk of future waves of the virus, and in particular now the third wave. Of critical importance is that we understand the factors associated with compliance with COVID-19 regulations and protocols, and the willingness to sacrifice select human rights happens to be one of these key factors. So people who are willing to sacrifice rights are more compliant when it comes to public health regulations and protocols. So here's an example, or here are examples of wearing masks. People who are willing to sacrifice human rights always are more likely to always wear their mask in public. People who believe that current restrictions are too strict are less willing to sacrifice their rights. And interestingly and importantly, people who are willing to take the COVID-19 vaccine are linked to the willingness to sacrifice human rights. What's linked to this, in a sense, is maybe the common good element that's coming through here, because we have views on human rights, sacrifice, and policy preferences. And the slide shows that those who are willing to sacrifice were more partial to increased value of social grants. And there's quite a big difference there. And in all these situations, then, the policy choices that were given to the respondents, we've looked at the social grants issue. People who are pro-sacrifice, more likely to support social grants. And then you can see the different patterns here, allowing cigarettes to be sold. And you can see the kind of logic that is coming through here. If you're not allowed to drink or smoke, you feel that your rights are being violated unnecessarily. Interestingly, there also, if you want places of worship to open, you feel that your rights are being restricted as well as the restrictions on movement and the restrictions on the number of funeral attendees. So that shows you the linkages between policy preferences and people's tendency to be willing or not to sacrifice their rights. So celebrating solidarity, which we see to some extent, while guarding against authoritarianism, public health emergencies place immense power in the hands of executive leadership, as they have done in South Africa. It can tend towards authoritarianism. We were fortunate, I think, that the Disaster Management Act was agreed upon as the legislation that would be used and not the emergency legislation, because the Disaster Management Act keeps rights intact and they are merely limited, and they should be limited in a reasonable and rational way. Our community has come together making big and small sacrifices for the common good, and we have seen that for ourselves, and we've also seen that through our research. But our willingness to accept sacrifice leads to the vulnerability of creeping authoritarianism. It's as if we give over our powers, our control. So government measures mitigated the spread of COVID-19, saved lives, and allowed health facilities to prepare. These were admirable outcomes, but with major consequences, particularly for the economy and also our freedom and autonomy. So we've made some policy recommendations based on this research, and it's just 3 quick ones. So we need participatory, inclusive, and adaptive processes in maintaining support and adherence to regulations. So participation has been advanced as a fundamental principle of human rights. It's also recognized so by the South African courts. So we would require openness, transparency, and inclusive forms of decision-making and effective communication about why certain regulations are necessary and rational. Individuals, communities, and stakeholders must have the space to provide feedback and share views. Even though there is not necessarily a participatory process prior to the regulations, there must be ongoing conversations about the regulations. The regulations must be of limited duration, evidence-based, and reviewable. This is emphasized in the United Nations Syracuse Principles of 1984. Any limitations in a public health crisis must be A, temporary, B, subject to review, and C, must not discriminate unfairly. So blanket bans such as that imposed on tobacco products are arguably ineffective and deeply polarizing to the extent that they reduce confidence in government's handling of the pandemic. And independent oversight of government actions is necessary. And here I mention both our discussants in the fact that we need active and continuous independent oversight by civil society and accountability mechanisms and independent institutions such as the South African Human Rights Commission, and of course the courts. So where necessary, regulation should be challenged, and this did happen during the lockdown. And it's largely been the case in South Africa, and thus I think any authoritarian tendencies have been kept in check, because there was also a very loud public conversation about all of this. And this should continue as South Africa's response to COVID-19 has mostly respected the rule of law. And we're not talking here about police brutality. I'm specifically looking at issues of the lockdown and the lockdown regulations related to freedom. But whether it ultimately comes out on the right or wrong side of human rights remains to be seen. So this is a quote from Edwin Santo, the America's Human Rights Commissioner. If combating COVID-19 is a war, we can be proud of why we got into the fight, to preserve life, especially for vulnerable people. Those are the best of our values. We must now ensure these same values guide how we fight at all times. This won't be easy, but our unbreakable commitment to human rights will make our sacrifices more bearable and will be vital as we rebuild after the war is won. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nania. This is such interesting research. I mean, so much of what we saw during last year was the lack of participation, the lack of public participation as the lockdown regulations were developed and issued, and there was constant talks with various sectoral representatives and very little with the people who would be truly affected. So this kind of work that gathers that information is really, really critical. I'd like to hand over to Mark for your comments, and then Sadiso, we will come to you. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nania, for, as Rachel said, a fascinating and very revealing presentation. I'll just make a few comments to start the discussion on the findings. But I want to be quite frank from the outset. You quoted me as saying that it remained to be seen whether we come out on the right side or the wrong side of human rights in our response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And I believe that it is now possible to say that we have come out very clearly on the wrong side of protection of human rights. And we can elaborate in this discussion, and the survey has given us some clues as to why that has happened. But I think it's important to say that upfront, because the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over. As Nania mentioned, we face the prospect of a third wave and possibly a fourth wave, given our failure to roll out vaccines. And that means the probability of future resort to further restrictions on human rights and violations on human rights, allegedly restrictions, limitations, allegedly carried out in the interests of the Section 27 right of everybody to have access to healthcare services, as well as important constitutional rights to dignity and life in particular. Justice Edwin Cameron framed it, I think, even more starkly in a recent article that he wrote in News 24, published in News 24, which was titled, "To Enforce the COVID-19 Lockdown, Did We Wage a War on the People of South Africa?" And Edwin Cameron answers his own question, that we did, in many respects, wage a war on the people of South Africa. I don't have the latest statistics, for example, on the number of arrests, many of them quite arbitrary arrests that took place during various phases of lockdown. But the last statistic I saw in February of this year was that there had been 350,000 arrests. So that would be my opening statement. And I think, as Nania has shown, whether people are willing to make sacrifices of rights and accept restrictions is very telling. What the findings suggest to me is that most people in South Africa are willing to make reasonable sacrifices, including of rights, in the interests of the greater good. It's an affirmation, if you like, of the whole notion of Ubuntu, a recognition that we are a society and that there is a social interest. That is a positive. And another positive, I think, is how the survey shows that there's a connection between those people who describe themselves as pro-human rights and pro-social behavior, as opposed to antisocial behavior being, for example, a refusal to wear a mask, a refusal to accept reasonable restrictions on movement, a refusal or an unwillingness to take a vaccine, despite the knowledge that a vaccine is not only of individual benefit, but has a social and a public health benefit. So I find the findings, as far as they go, quite affirming of South Africa's population and its attitudes and its understanding of human rights. But I guess the crux really is whether that understanding has been abused, has been taken advantage of by government in its response to the epidemic. And there is where I don't have Section 36 of the Constitution in front of me. Nania quoted it, and Nania talked about it as being, technical legal. And I know you didn't quite mean it in this way, Nania, but I think Section 36 is fundamental to how we understand the proportionality of the restrictions on human rights that have taken place over the last year. It's fundamental because it refers to proportionality. It refers to less restrictive means of achieving the end, and that end, of course, is saving lives, preventing infections, preventing deaths. It refers to measures, restrictions that are always consonant with people's dignity. And I guess I would say that is the lens through which almost exactly 1 year, in fact, 1 year on Friday into the start of the hard lockdown, we have to evaluate the response that we have been subject to. So let me just make a couple of other comments before handing over to Sediso. I think the failures have been that all of these restrictions, and this may be contentious to say, these limitations of rights in the interests of saving lives have ultimately had fairly limited effect in either preventing infections or preventing deaths. South Africa, let me put it bluntly, perhaps controversially, has one of the worst COVID-19 pandemics, or is one of the worst places where the COVID-19 pandemic has affected any country in the world. Although our official statistics place COVID-19 infections at about 1.5 million. I haven't looked at them for a couple of days. The reality is that is somebody like Alex van der Heerwe raises the prospect that we may actually have had up to 20 million COVID-19 infections. Somebody like Shabir Mahdi may not put it at 20 million, but he would certainly say that the figure is much, much higher. Although the official death statistics recorded COVID-19 cases is just over 50,000, we are now approaching 150,000 excess deaths in the period since the 3rd of May last year to the 13th of March this year. So if the purpose of the limitations of rights was to contain the epidemic, then it cannot be said that those sacrifices were worthwhile for the people who made them. And the people who made those sacrifices, by the way, was not proportionate. The people who've made the greatest sacrifices and been asked to make the greatest sacrifices throughout this pandemic have been the people who are already the most vulnerable and already the most poor, who have sacrificed food and who have sacrificed livelihoods, and who have sacrificed jobs. So did the means justify the ends? No. The second point I would make is, could those means ever have achieved the ends, i.e. successful containment and saving lives? And here I think again is where we've missed a vital learning from the HIV epidemic, which put the centrality of human rights, that in fact, rather than restricting rights in the interests of public health crises are times where you enhance and take extra measures to protect rights, because by protecting rights, you have a paradox that you protect public health. In the case of HIV, it was called a paradox because people said, in order to protect the rights of the uninfected with HIV, you have to put special emphasis on protecting the rights of people who have HIV and who are most vulnerable. It appeared to be a contradiction to traditional thinking about public health. I think that vital lesson has been lost in the COVID-19 response. And what it's meant has been that very often the response has been one that has relied on coercion and government force and power to try to contain the epidemic rather than social contract and engagement. I'm not going to go into details about the lockdown or the various lockdowns, except to say that it strikes me increasingly as I've traveled around different parts of the country, what a blunt instrument the lockdown has been in terms of one instrument for 1,000 or 1,000,000 different types of situations, and it has taken away or not even accepted that there is a possibility of community agency or individual agency as an actor, as 60 million actors or 50 million actors in COVID-19 prevention. So community engagement, community treatment literacy, community solidarity, community action to deal with food insecurity is something that has taken place on the sidelines more through civic and civil society engagement than it has taken place as a result of government policy and considered action as part of the strategy of this response. I witnessed it, let me say anecdotally, that I was in a discussion 3 days before the start of the first hard lockdown on March the 26th last year, with Zweli Mkhize, with all of the top scientists of our country, where for the first time, the idea of a lockdown was introduced, and all of the people in that discussion, the consensus, including the consensus with Dr. Mkhize, was that to prematurely introduce a hard lockdown without having first put in place measures to mitigate the predictable adverse socioeconomic consequences would be extremely ill considered, and that a hard lockdown without simultaneously having in place means to ensure testing and tracing and to lock down transmission, as it were, in that way would also be ill considered. Despite that advice, 4 days later, we went into the beginning of one of the most hardest lockdowns of any country in the world. And that brings me to my last point in relation to the findings and the recommendations made by Nania and others in the team, which is the paucity and the poor quality of communication and of access to information throughout this epidemic, something that even under the State of Disaster Act, people have a right of access to far more information on a daily basis about the disaster than we have ever been provided with. What we've been provided with is numbers of infections, numbers of recoveries, numbers of deaths, the barest of information, if you like. Trying to get any other information has been like trying to squeeze blood out of a stone. And that is not good for a social contract where the populace has indicated a willingness to play ball and to sacrifice and to undergo necessary and reasonable and proportional limitations on rights in the interests of a greater good, when there is not a sharing by government as to what that greater good actually is and what the progress is. And that failure carries through until today, where we sit here now in a country on the verge of a third wave, not having really started a vaccine program, not knowing what is happening with the vaccine program, when phase 2 of the vaccine program will commence, and what measures are being taken to try to ensure that pharmaceutical interventions can be combined with non-pharmaceutical interventions to try to make sure that we get on top of this COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm afraid that my comments in response to this, I think, very important survey and its findings, and particularly its indication of people's willingness to make sacrifices, is largely not a positive one. But I think the value of this findings is that it can help guide us as we go through the future stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've made no comment in my response here to the question of the impact on socio-economic rights and the foregoing of fundamental rights, such as rights of access to sufficient food, to sufficient water, the lack of mitigating measures put in place in response to that, et cetera. But obviously the presentation is multi-layered and multi-dimensional, and I've probably said too much already. So let me stop at that point and hand over to Sediso. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I think it's really, really important to hear and to have it all put in that perspective, particularly the point about, who are those people who are most willing to sacrifice those rights, and what are the sacrifices that they have already made. Sediso, we're really keen to hear from you and the perspective of the South African Human Rights Commission that has played a really important role over the past year. So over to you, Sediso.
Thank you, and Rachel, and thanks to Nani and colleagues for a very useful contribution to the discourse as to how we as a country deal with the challenges of COVID-19 and the impact thereof on human rights. I also want to thank Mark for his inputs as well. And I would like to take a slightly different approach and say that, from where we stand, I think the response of government to COVID-19 was really a response, an attempt to try and ensure that, we sail through the storms of COVID-19 and try and maintain our democracy and try and protect human rights, even though, of course, some rights had to be limited. So that's really my perspective. I don't think it was done to undermine human rights per se. However, we are quite aware that in the process, there has been a tremendous amount of human rights violations, the conduct of law enforcement officials, some of the matters which we ourselves as a commission, sorry, my battery is running low, some of which we as a commission are dealing with. We are also quite aware of the impact, some of these measures have had on basic education. We even had a meeting with the Minister of Basic Education where we've been threatened to litigate because we're quite unhappy about some of the consequences thereof, whether you close schools or you don't open, or you don't close schools, and also the issues of digital divide. Can I just move a little bit? Thanks. Okay. Oh, sorry, I was just having power problems. Yeah, some of the implications of a digital divide, which are still here. So in that sense, COVID-19 also highlighted the gaps and the fault lines in our country as far as the enjoyment of human rights are concerned, whether it's in terms of education or in terms of access to health. Now, from where we stand, I think one of the major blunders by the state in responding to the challenge of COVID-19 was not to engage or consult widely, especially those of us in the human rights space, to advise government as to how best we can deal with our responses to COVID-19, which are inherently, to a large extent, a limitation of rights. How best you do this so that you don't have the results which we're seeing now, including what Mark was saying. This might have been a blunt instrument, in responding to a human rights challenge. And we as a commission then tried, to communicate with the National Command, and we also had a meeting with the Minister of COPTA and Dr. Kosana Zuma, but we were never invited.
Well, some interesting insights coming out of that conversation from the HSRC and the UJ webinar regarding South African sentiments regarding the impacts of the lockdown on their human rights. And with that, it's a goodbye from us. Thanks for watching.